The letter from Emma Roberts trembled in Kieran Armstrong's weathered hands as the train whistle pierced the crisp autumn air of Willow Creek, Montana Territory, 1885. Sweat beaded on her brow despite the cool September breeze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she clutched baby Thomas to her chest. His tiny fists curled against the worn wool of her traveling dress. Emma had boarded the westbound train in Boston with nothing but hope, a small carpetbag of belongings, and another man's child. Now, as she stepped onto the wooden platform of the depot, her eyes frantically scanned the small crowd for the face of Edwin Porter, the man who had promised her a new life through carefully penned letters exchanged over 6 months. Last stop, Willow Creek. The conductor called, his voice fading beneath the hiss of steam as Emma adjusted Thomas on her hip. "Excuse me," she asked a weathered station attendant sweeping nearby. "I'm looking for Mr. Edwin Porter. He was to meet me here today." The attendant's broom stilled, his gray eyebrows knitting together. "Edwin Porter, madam, I'm afraid." Emma's stomach twisted into a knot as the man explained that Edwin Porter had died 2 weeks prior in a mining accident. The letters she'd received, the promises of marriage, the hope for a new beginning, all buried with him. "No, there must be some mistake," Emma whispered, bouncing Thomas gently as he began to fuss. "I've come all this way, I sold everything." The station emptied as the train pulled away, leaving Emma standing alone with her carpetbag at her feet and Thomas whimpering in her arms. The Montana sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the platform as reality settled heavy upon her shoulders. "Madam." "You waiting for someone?" The deep voice startled Emma, and she turned to find a tall man regarding her with curious blue eyes. His broad shoulders filled out a simple cotton shirt, and dust clung to his denim pants, suggesting a long day's work. A well-worn cowboy hat sat atop sandy brown hair, and a gentle smile played across his lips as he nodded toward Thomas. I was," Emma answered, her voice catching, "but it seems he's not coming." The stranger's gaze softened as he took in her situation, a young woman alone, a baby in her arms, the confusion and fear evident on her face. "I'm Kieran Armstrong," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Town's rancher. You look like you could use some help." Emma hesitated, then shifted Thomas to balance on one hip so she could accept the handshake. "Emma Roberts, and this is Thomas. I was to meet Edwin Porter. We were to be married." Kieran's expression fell. "Edwin Porter." "Madam, I'm sorry to tell you, but I know," Emma cut in, unable to hear the words again. "The station attendant just told me." A silence stretched between them as Thomas's cries grew louder. The baby's face reddened, tiny fists flailing in protest of hunger or discomfort or both. "You have anywhere to go?" Kieran asked, his eyes sincere. Emma shook her head, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "No, I spent everything I had on the train ticket." Kieran nodded thoughtfully, then glanced at the darkening sky. "Night's coming." "Town's small, but there's a boarding house run by Mrs. Holloway. She's a good woman. I can take you there if you'd like." "I have no money," Emma admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. Kieran's gaze moved from Emma to the fussing infant. Something in his expression shifted, a decision made. "Then you and the little one will come to my ranch for the night. Tomorrow we can figure things out." Emma took a step back, suspicion flaring. "I couldn't possibly impose, Madam Miss Roberts, it's nearly dark, you're alone with a baby and you've nowhere to go. My sister lives at the ranch too." "You'll be proper safe," he offered a reassuring smile. "I'm just trying to help." As if to emphasize the urgency, a chilly wind gusted across the platform, causing Thomas to wail louder. Emma clutched him closer, weighing her limited options. "All right," she finally agreed, her voice barely audible over the baby's cries. "Just for tonight." Kieran nodded, picking up her carpetbag with one hand and gesturing toward a wagon parked nearby. "This way." Emma followed him, climbing carefully into the wagon with Thomas still crying against her shoulder. Kieran loaded her bag, then climbed up beside her, taking the reins in his capable hands. "You hungry?" Kieran asked, nodding toward Thomas. "Probably, and tired. It's been a long journey." Kieran clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward. My sister, Margaret, she'll help. She has a little one of her own. As they pulled away from the depot, Emma cast one last glance at the empty platform, the place where her dreams had died alongside the man she'd never met. Then she turned her eyes forward to the rugged landscape stretching before them and the uncertain future that awaited. "I'll raise him," Kieran said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "What?" Emma asked, certain she'd misheard. Kieran glanced at her, then at the now quieting baby. "The boy, if you need time to get on your feet, find work. I'll help raise him. We can figure something out." Emma stared at the stranger beside her, this cowboy who offered assistance without hesitation. In the fading light, she couldn't quite read his expression, but his voice carried sincerity she hadn't expected. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Kieran shrugged, the movement almost imperceptible. "Because it's the right thing to do." The wagon continued along the rutted road as twilight descended upon the Montana territory, and Emma Roberts held her breath, wondering if fate had delivered her not to the man who had promised to be her husband, but to someone who might prove to be something else entirely. Kieran Armstrong's ranch sprawled across a verdant valley, modest compared to some but impressive to Emma's eastern eyes. A two-story farmhouse stood sentinel over a collection of outbuildings, its windows glowing with welcoming lamplight as Kieran guided the wagon into the yard. "Margaret," he called as he helped Emma down. "We've got company." The front door swung open, spilling golden light onto the porch as a woman emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. Her resemblance to Kieran was unmistakable, the same blue eyes and sandy hair, though hers hung in a thick braid over one shoulder. "Kieran, what on earth?" Margaret's words halted as she caught sight of Emma and the baby. "Oh, this is Miss Emma Roberts," Kieran explained, retrieving Emma's carpetbag. "She came to marry Edwin Porter." Understanding immediately dawned on Margaret's face. "Oh dear, come in quickly. That poor baby must be freezing." Inside, the house was modest but comfortable, with well-worn furniture arranged around a stone hearth where a fire crackled cheerfully. A delicious aroma filled the air, and Emma's stomach growled in response. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. "I'm Margaret Armstrong Wilson," Kieran's sister introduced herself, already reaching to take Thomas. "May I? You look exhausted, and I'm quite good with little ones. My James is finally asleep upstairs." Grateful, Emma surrendered the baby, watching as Margaret expertly cradled him. "He's probably hungry. I have a bottle in my bag, but I'll need to prepare his formula." "Kitchen's this way," Margaret said, leading her through the house. "Kieran, stoke that fire, would you, and bring in more wood. It's getting colder tonight." Emma followed Margaret into a warm kitchen, where a pot of stew simmered on a cast-iron stove. As Emma prepared Thomas's bottle, Margaret settled into a chair, rocking the baby gently. "How old is he?" she asked. 4 months, Emma replied, testing the temperature of the formula on her wrist. "Born in May." Margaret nodded, then hesitated before asking, "Is he yours?" Emma stilled the bottle halfway to Thomas. "Not by birth," she admitted quietly. "His mother was my dearest friend. She died in childbirth. His father wasn't in the picture." "I'm sorry," Margaret murmured. "Caroline made me promise to care for him," Emma continued, taking Thomas back to feed him. "I did the best I could in Boston, but there were few options for an unmarried woman with a child." "So you answered an advertisement," Margaret surmised. Emma nodded. "Edwin seemed kind in his letters." "He wrote that he didn't mind about Thomas." She blinked rapidly. "I never imagined he wouldn't be here." Margaret reached across to squeeze Emma's hand. "Life out here can be harsh, but people look after one another. We'll help you figure something out." Kieran entered the kitchen then, bringing with him the scent of cold night air. "Fire's built up," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His eyes landed on Thomas, now contentedly drinking his bottle. "How's the little fellow doing?" "Better," Emma answered. "Thank you both for your kindness." Kieran nodded, then exchanged a look with his sister that Emma couldn't quite interpret. "You'll stay here tonight," Margaret said definitively. "We have a spare room upstairs. Tomorrow we can discuss what comes next." After a hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread, Emma found herself in a small but clean bedroom, a trundle crib that had belonged to Margaret's son positioned beside the bed. Thomas slept peacefully, exhausted from the journey and content with a full stomach. Emma stood at the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape of Kieran Armstrong's ranch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, the sound haunting and wild, so different from Boston's crowded streets and constant noise. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called quietly. Kieran entered, carrying an extra quilt. "Margaret thought you might need this. Nights get cold." "Thank you." Emma accepted the blanket, their fingers brushing momentarily. Kieran's gaze moved to the sleeping baby. He seemed settled. "For now," Emma smiled weakly. "He'll be up before dawn, I expect." Kieran nodded, lingering in the doorway. "Miss Roberts, I meant what I said earlier, about helping with the boy." Emma studied him, this man she'd known for mere hours who offered so much. "Why, you owe us nothing." Kieran's eyes met hers, steady and clear. "I believe a man should help when he can, that's all, and your offer to raise him." Kieran shifted his weight, his expression thoughtful. "I've got this ranch, a good living. It's a fine place for a child to grow." He paused. "I know what it's like to lose family, to need someone to step in." Emma's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "Our parents died when Margaret and I were young," he explained, his voice softening. "Influenza, our uncle raised us, taught me everything about ranching." "Good man." "I'm sorry about your parents." Kieran acknowledged her sympathy with a small nod. "Life happens as it will, we make the best of what comes." He straightened, seeming to remember himself. "Anyway, get some rest, we can talk more tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Emma found herself calling after him. "Mr. Armstrong," he paused, looking back. "Thank you," she said simply. A smile touched his lips, transforming his serious face. "You're welcome, Miss Roberts. Good night." After he closed the door, Emma sank onto the edge of the bed, the borrowed quilt clutched in her hands. Outside, the Montana night deepened, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast sky. Inside, for the first time since learning of Edwin Porter's death, Emma felt the faintest flicker of hope. Dawn broke with Thomas's hungry cries, just as Emma had predicted. She quickly prepared his bottle, grateful for the small stove in the corner of the bedroom that Margaret had thoughtfully lit before retiring. As she fed the baby, Emma gazed out the window at Kieran Armstrong's ranch bathed in early morning light. The property stretched toward distant mountains, cattle dotting the landscape like dark specks against the golden grass. A creek wound through the valley, its water catching the sunrise in flashes of pink and orange. It was beautiful in a way Boston could never be, wild and open, promising freedom but demanding resilience. Emma dressed in her second-best dress, a dark blue cotton with modest lace at the collar, and carefully arranged her hair. With Thomas balanced on her hip, she made her way downstairs, following the aroma of coffee and the sound of voices from the kitchen. She paused in the hallway, listening to Kieran and Margaret's conversation. "Not as simple as you're making it out to be, Kieran," Margaret was saying. "She's a stranger." "She needs help, Maggie," Kieran replied, "and she's alone with that baby." "I'm not saying we shouldn't help." "But your offer to raise the child, what exactly are you proposing?" There was a pause, and Emma strained to hear Kieran's response. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I couldn't leave them at that depot." "Your heart's always been too big for your own good," Margaret sighed. "Just be careful." "For everyone's sake." Emma chose that moment to enter, pretending she hadn't overheard. "Good morning," she said brightly. Both siblings turned, Margaret at the stove and Kieran at the table with a cup of coffee. A small boy, no more than 3 years old, sat beside him, enthusiastically attacking a plate of scrambled eggs. "There you are," Margaret smiled. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in weeks," Emma admitted. The train wasn't exactly conducive to rest. "This is my son, James," Margaret introduced the boy, who looked up with curious eyes and a face smeared with egg. "James, say good morning to Miss Roberts." "Gee morning," the child mumbled around his breakfast. "And good morning to you too, little man," Margaret cooed at Thomas, who was now wide awake and taking in his surroundings with bright eyes. "Bring him here, I'll hold him while you eat." Emma gratefully surrendered the baby and accepted a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that made her mouth water. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until food was before her. "I thought we might ride into town today," Kieran said, watching Emma eat with evident satisfaction. "Let you see Willow Creek, maybe talk to some folks about work if that's what you're wanting." Emma nodded, swallowing a bite of biscuit. "That would be helpful. I need to find employment quickly." "What did you do in Boston?" Margaret asked, bouncing Thomas on her knee. "I worked as a seamstress in a dress shop," Emma replied. "Before that, I was a teacher's assistant at a girls' school, but they dismissed me when I took in Thomas." Her expression darkened briefly. Unmarried women with babies aren't considered suitable influences on young ladies. Kieran's jaw tightened. "Seems unfair." "It's the way of things," Emma said with resignation. "I'm a practical woman, Mr. Armstrong. I understand how the world works." "Willow Creek might surprise you," Margaret offered. "It's a small community but generally kind-hearted. And we desperately need a schoolteacher. Ours left last spring to marry a man from Helena." Emma brightened. "Really, I love teaching." "Mind you, it's a one-room schoolhouse with children aged 5 to 16 and the pay is modest," Margaret cautioned. "But it comes with living quarters, a small cabin behind the school." "That sounds perfect," Emma said, hope rising in her chest. "Who would I speak to about it?" "Mayor Thompson," Kieran answered. "He's also the town banker. We can visit him this morning." After breakfast, Margaret insisted on keeping Thomas. "I'm home with James today anyway," she explained. "It'll be easier for you to speak with folks in town without juggling the baby." Though reluctant to be separated from Thomas, Emma recognized the practicality of the suggestion. She followed Kieran outside to the wagon, noticing for the first time the full scope of his operation. Several ranch hands were already at work, tending to horses in the corral and moving cattle in a distant pasture. "Your ranch is impressive," she remarked as he helped her into the wagon. "Been in the family since my grandfather's time," Kieran said, climbing up beside her. "Started small, but we've added land over the years." "We?" Emma questioned. Kieran clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward. "My brother-in-law, Daniel Wilson, was my partner until 2 years ago. He died in a flash flood while moving cattle." He glanced at the house. "That's when Margaret and James moved in with me." "I'm sorry," Emma said, understanding now why Margaret had been so quickly sympathetic to her situation. "You've both experienced considerable loss." Kieran nodded, his eyes on the road. "Life out here can be harsh, but there's beauty in it too." He gestured toward the mountains rising in the distance. "Freedom like nowhere else." The ride to Willow Creek took nearly an hour, giving Emma time to appreciate the vastness of the Montana landscape. When the town finally came into view, she was surprised by its size larger than she'd expected, with a main street boasting a variety of businesses. "It's grown considerably in recent years," Kieran explained, guiding the wagon down the dusty street. "The railroad brought more settlers, and there's good ranching and some mining in these parts." He pointed out landmarks as they passed the general store, a hotel, the sheriff's office, a saloon that he advised Emma to avoid, and finally the small whitewashed schoolhouse set back from the main road. "What do you think?" Kieran asked, watching her face. Emma studied the building with its bell tower and welcoming front steps. Behind it, she could see the small cabin that would be her home if she secured the position. "It's lovely," she breathed. Kieran smiled, seeming pleased by her reaction. "Mayor Thompson's office is just ahead." As they tied the horses at the hitching post outside the bank, Emma smoothed her dress nervously. "Do I look presentable? First impressions are important." Kieran's gaze traveled over her, lingering momentarily on her face. "You look fine, Miss Roberts, more than fine." Something in his tone made Emma's cheeks warm, and she quickly turned toward the bank entrance. "Shall we?" Mayor Horace Thompson proved to be a portly, amiable man with impressive mutton chop whiskers and a booming voice. He listened attentively as Emma explained her qualifications, nodding appreciatively. "A Boston education, you say, and experience teaching young ladies." He glanced at Kieran. "Armstrong, you've brought us quite a find." "Miss Roberts just arrived yesterday," Kieran explained, standing respectfully with his hat in his hands. "She was to marry Edwin Porter." Thompson's expression sobered. "Ah, yes, tragic business, that mining accident. My condolences, Miss Roberts." "Thank you," Emma replied. I find myself in need of employment, and Mrs. Wilson mentioned the teaching position. Indeed, indeed. We've been making do with Mrs. Holloway's daughter filling in, but she's expecting her first child and can't continue. Thompson stroked his whiskers thoughtfully. The position pays $30 a month with the cabin provided. Term starts in 2 weeks. Emma's heart leaped. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to support herself and Thomas. I would be most grateful for the opportunity, Mayor Thompson. There is the matter of the child, Thompson said carefully. I understand you have an infant. Emma's stomach tightened. Yes, Thomas is 4 months old. I adopted him when his mother died. Thompson exchanged a look with Kieran that Emma couldn't decipher. The school board may have concerns about a teacher with a baby to care for. I can vouch for Miss Roberts, Kieran interjected, and arrangements can be made for the child's care during school hours. Emma shot him a grateful look. Thompson considered for a moment, then nodded. I'll call a meeting of the school board for tomorrow evening. In the meantime, Miss Roberts, you're welcome to inspect the schoolhouse and cabin. As they left the bank, Emma could hardly contain her excitement. Do you think they'll approve my appointment? Thompson seemed impressed, Kieran replied, leading her toward the schoolhouse. And teachers are hard to come by out here. I'd say your chances are good. They spent the next hour exploring the schoolhouse, a single large room with rows of desks, a pot-bellied stove for heating, and a small collection of books in the cabin behind it. The latter was basic but clean, with a main room serving as kitchen and living area and a small bedroom. A pump behind the cabin provided water, and an outhouse stood discreetly at the edge of the property. It's perfect, Emma declared, imagining herself and Thomas in this little home. It's humble, Kieran corrected, watching her with amusement. It's ours, Emma replied simply. Then, catching herself, she amended, or it could be if the school board approves. As they continued their tour of Willow Creek, Kieran introduced Emma to various townspeople, all of whom welcomed her warmly once they learned she might be the new teacher. By the time they stopped for lunch at the small cafe run by Mrs. Jenkins, Emma was feeling more hopeful than she had in months. Everyone seems so friendly, she remarked, savoring a bowl of hearty stew. Small towns rely on each other, Kieran explained. And newcomers are always interesting, especially pretty ones. He immediately looked down at his plate as if embarrassed by his words. Emma felt that warmth in her cheeks again. You've been very kind, Mr. Armstrong. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Kieran's eyes met hers. No repayment necessary, Miss Roberts, but I was thinking, if you do get the teaching position, Thomas will need care during school hours. Yes, I've been concerned about that, Emma admitted. Margaret would be happy to watch him, I'm sure. She's home with James anyway. He hesitated. And on days when the weather's bad, or if you need help, you could both stay at the ranch. It's a fair distance to town in winter. Emma studied him curiously. Why are you doing all this? Taking in strangers, offering help? Kieran considered the question, his expression thoughtful. When I was 12 and Margaret was 10, our parents died within a week of each other. Our uncle took us in without hesitation, even though he was a bachelor with no experience raising children. He paused. He always said that when someone needs help and you can give it, there's no decision to make. It's just what you do. The simplicity and sincerity of his philosophy touched Emma deeply. Your uncle sounds like a wise man. He was, Kieran agreed. Died 5 years ago, left me the ranch. And you took in your sister and nephew when they needed you, Emma observed. Just as your uncle took you in, Kieran shrugged, uncomfortable with her assessment. Family looks after family. But Thomas and I aren't your family, Emma pointed out softly. Something flickered in Kieran's blue eyes, something Emma couldn't quite name. Everyone needs someone in their corner, Miss Roberts. Right now, I'm in yours. Their gazes held for a long moment until Mrs. Jenkins arrived with apple pie, breaking the spell that had momentarily descended between them. As they drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, Emma's mind was filled with possibilities. A teaching position, a home for herself and Thomas, the kindness of strangers becoming friends. Perhaps Willow Creek could be the fresh start she'd hoped for when answering Edwin Porter's advertisement. Penny for your thoughts, Kieran asked, glancing sideways at her. Emma smiled, watching the landscape roll by. I'm thinking that sometimes life takes unexpected turns, but perhaps they lead us where we're meant to be. Kieran nodded, his expression suggesting he understood completely. I believe that too. As the wagon crested a hill, offering a panoramic view of Kieran's ranch nestled in the valley below, Emma allowed herself to imagine a future here, not the one she'd planned with Edwin Porter, but something new and undefined, with possibilities she hadn't considered before today. And if she occasionally found her gaze drawn to the profile of the man beside her, his strong hands confidently handling the reins and his eyes reflecting the vast Montana sky, she told herself it was merely gratitude she was feeling, nothing more. The school board meeting the following evening was held in the town hall, a modest building that doubled as the church on Sundays. Emma dressed in her best outfit, a dark green traveling suit that emphasized her slender waist and brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. She arranged her auburn hair in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck, determined to present herself as the respectable, capable teacher Willow Creek needed. Margaret insisted on keeping Thomas again. A roomful of stuffy board members is no place for a baby, she declared. Besides, he and James have taken quite a shine to each other. It was true. The toddler had appointed himself Thomas's protector, bringing toys for the baby and speaking to him in the earnest, gentle tones of a child playing at being grown. Kieran drove Emma to town, uncharacteristically quiet during the journey. He too had dressed more formally than usual, in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his least worn pair of trousers. You didn't need to accompany me, Emma said as they neared Willow Creek. I'm sure you have ranch business to attend to. The hands can manage for one evening, Kieran replied. Besides, I'm on the school board. Emma's eyes widened. You are? You didn't mention that yesterday, Kieran shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable. Didn't seem right to boast about it. But yes, I've served for 3 years now. Will that help my case? Emma asked hopefully. I'll speak in your favor, Kieran promised, but I'm just one vote of 7. The school board consisted of Mayor Thompson, Kieran, the town doctor, the minister, Mrs. Holloway, who ran the boarding house, Mr. Jenkins, who owned the cafe, and Sheriff Davis. They sat in a row behind a long table, with Emma positioned before them like a defendant awaiting judgment. Mayor Thompson began the proceedings by introducing Emma and summarizing her qualifications. Then each board member took turns asking questions about her education, teaching experience, and plans for the Willow Creek School. Emma answered confidently, drawing on her years assisting at the Boston Girls' School and outlining her vision for education that combined academic rigor with practical skills useful for life in the West. Then came the question she'd been dreading. Miss Roberts, Mrs. Holloway began, her expression kind but concerned. We understand you have an infant in your care. How do you propose to manage your teaching duties while raising a child alone? Emma took a deep breath. Thomas is indeed in my care, and my responsibility to him is one I take very seriously. However, Mrs. Wilson has generously offered to watch him during school hours as she is already at home with her young son. Margaret Armstrong Wilson, the doctor clarified. Kieran's sister? Yes, Emma confirmed. She and Thomas have already formed a bond. The board members exchanged glances and Emma felt her confidence wavering. Had she said something wrong, Miss Roberts, Sheriff Davis spoke up. Forgive my bluntness, but there's another concern. You arrived in Willow Creek expecting to marry, but now find yourself alone. Some parents might worry about an unmarried woman living alone, especially one caring for a child without a husband. Emma's cheeks flushed with indignation. I assure you, Sheriff, my moral character is beyond reproach. Thomas is my legal ward, adopted after his mother's death. As for living alone, many teachers across this country are unmarried women. It's considered a respectable profession precisely because it can be pursued by women without male guardianship. Kieran cleared his throat. If I may, he interjected, drawing all eyes to him. Miss Roberts came to Willow Creek in good faith, expecting to begin a new life as Edwin Porter's wife. His death was tragic, but hardly reflects on her character. She's educated, capable, and exactly what our schoolchildren need. He paused, his voice growing more passionate. As for concerns about her raising Thomas alone, I've already offered to help. In fact, he stopped abruptly, seeming to reconsider his words. Yes, Mr. Armstrong, Mayor Thompson prompted. Kieran's gaze shifted to Emma, something unspoken passing between them. In fact, I believe the arrangement with my sister watching Thomas during school hours addresses any practical concerns. The board deliberated for another 30 minutes, during which Emma was asked to wait outside. She paced the small anteroom, equal parts nervous and indignant. The questions about her moral character still stung, though she understood the small town's concerns. Finally, Mayor Thompson called her back in. 7 solemn faces regarded her as she took her place before them once more. Miss Emma Roberts, Thompson began formally, after careful consideration, the Willow Creek School Board is pleased to offer you the position of schoolteacher, beginning with the fall term on September 15th. Relief flooded through Emma, making her knees weak. Thank you, she managed. I accept with gratitude, and I promise to serve the children of Willow Creek to the best of my ability. There were smiles and handshakes all around, with even Sheriff Davis offering grudging congratulations. Mrs. Holloway invited Emma to stay at the boarding house until she could move into the teacher's cabin, an offer Emma gratefully accepted. You'll need to prepare the cabin first, Mrs. Holloway explained. It's been empty since spring. A good cleaning and some fresh linens will make it homey. I can help with that, Kieran volunteered, standing beside Emma. My ranch hands can do any repairs needed. As they left the town hall, darkness had fallen over Willow Creek, stars speckling the vast sky above. Emma walked beside Kieran toward the wagon, her heart light with the success of the evening. Thank you for your support in there, she said sincerely. I know having you on the board helped my case. Kieran shook his head. You won yourself that position, Miss Roberts. I just spoke the truth as I see it. Still, I'm grateful. She hesitated, then added, What were you going to say? Before you stopped yourself, Kieran helped her into the wagon, taking his time to respond. When he finally settled beside her and picked up the reins, his expression was difficult to read in the darkness. I was going to make a different offer, he admitted, but I realized it might have been premature. What kind of offer? Emma pressed, curiosity overcoming propriety. Kieran clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward before answering. The kind that would have addressed Sheriff Davis's concerns permanently, but might have startled you considerably. He glanced at her, and probably scandalized the entire board. Emma's breath caught as she realized what he was implying. Mr. Armstrong, are you saying you nearly proposed marriage to me in front of the school board? It crossed my mind, he confessed, his voice gruff with embarrassment, as a practical solution to the situation. A practical solution, Emma repeated, unsure whether to be flattered or offended. I didn't say it well, Kieran sighed. I'm not much for fancy words, Miss Roberts, but yes, I considered it. We get along well enough. You need security, Thomas needs a father, and he stopped abruptly. And you, Emma prompted softly. Kieran kept his eyes on the road. I've been alone a long while. The ranch is successful, but empty in ways that matter. They rode in silence for several minutes, the clip-clop of hooves and the occasional night birds call the only sounds. Emma's mind whirled with this revelation. A marriage of convenience wasn't what she'd come to Montana seeking. She'd hoped for something genuine with Edwin Porter, based on their correspondence. But Kieran Armstrong was offering something equally practical, yet somehow more honest. I'm not asking now, Kieran finally said. We barely know each other, but I wanted you to understand what I was thinking in there. I appreciate your honesty, Emma replied carefully, and I'm not dismissing the idea outright, but as you said, we hardly know each other. Kieran nodded, seeming relieved by her measured response. Then perhaps we should remedy that, take time to become better acquainted while you settle into your teaching position. I'd like that, Emma agreed, surprising herself with her sincerity. The rest of the journey passed in comfortable conversation, with Kieran sharing stories of growing up on the ranch and Emma recounting tales of her childhood in Boston. By the time they reached the Armstrong property, a tentative friendship had been established or perhaps reinforced between them. Margaret was waiting up, Thomas asleep in her arms. "How did it go?" she whispered eagerly as they entered. "I got the position," Emma confirmed, carefully taking Thomas from her. "I start in 2 weeks." "Wonderful," Margaret beamed. "I told James we might have new neighbors soon." "He's quite excited. Mrs. Holloway offered me a room at the boarding house until I can prepare the cabin," Emma explained. "I thought we might move in tomorrow if that's not too sudden." Something like disappointment flickered across Margaret's face. "Of course, whatever you think best." "Actually," Kieran interjected, "I was thinking you might stay here until the cabin's properly ready. No sense paying for boarding when we have room, and it would give us time to make any necessary repairs." Emma glanced between the siblings, sensing an unspoken communication. "If you're sure it's no imposition." "None at all," Margaret assured her quickly. "And I meant what I said about watching Thomas during school hours. It would be a joy." "Then I accept," Emma decided, "but only until the cabin is ready. I wouldn't want to overstay my welcome." Later, as Emma settled Thomas in his makeshift crib, she reflected on the surprising turn her life had taken in just 2 days. She'd arrived in Willow Creek expecting to marry a stranger and found him dead, only to be taken in by another stranger who now hinted at the possibility of marriage. It wasn't the path she'd planned, but Emma was beginning to understand what Kieran had meant about life taking unexpected turns. As she gazed down at Thomas, peacefully sleeping after his evening bottle, she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for the kindness she'd found in Willow Creek, and especially from the Armstrong family. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity as Emma prepared both for the school term and for her move to the teacher's cabin. Each morning, Kieran drove into town on ranch business, taking Emma with him to work at the schoolhouse. She cataloged the existing books, created lesson plans for students of various ages, and thoroughly cleaned the one-room school. In the afternoons, she turned her attention to the cabin, scrubbing floors, washing windows, and arranging the few pieces of furniture provided. Kieran's ranch hands, true to his word, repaired a leaking roof, replaced broken window panes, and constructed shelves for Emma's belongings. Throughout it all, Thomas remained at the ranch with Margaret, thriving under her experienced care. Each evening when Emma and Kieran returned, the baby greeted them with increasing recognition, his face lighting up at the sight of Emma in a way that made her heart swell. "He's getting more alert every day," Margaret commented one evening as they watched Thomas batting at a wooden toy James had outgrown, "and he's trying to roll over. Won't be long before he's crawling." "I can hardly believe how quickly he's changing," Emma marveled. "When Caroline placed him in my arms, he was so tiny and fragile. Now look at him." "You're doing a wonderful job with him," Margaret assured her, patting Emma's hand. "He's a happy, healthy baby." "With your help," Emma acknowledged gratefully. As the days passed, Emma found herself growing increasingly comfortable at the Armstrong ranch. Mornings began with breakfast shared around the kitchen table. Evenings ended with conversation by the hearth after the children were asleep. She learned that Kieran rose before dawn each day to begin ranch work, that he played the harmonica quite beautifully on quiet evenings, and that he had a surprising knowledge of literature despite his limited formal education. "My mother insisted on reading to us every night," he explained when Emma expressed surprise at his familiarity with Shakespeare. "Said just because we lived on a ranch didn't mean our minds should be as rough as our hands." For his part, Kieran seemed genuinely interested in Emma's stories of Boston, asking thoughtful questions about her upbringing and education. They discovered shared interests in history and astronomy, and often found themselves continuing discussions long after Margaret had retired for the night. "You should see the stars from the north pasture," Kieran told her one evening as they sat on the porch, the September air growing increasingly crisp. "No trees to block the view. On clear nights, it feels like you could reach up and touch them." "I'd like that," Emma replied, then hastily added, "to see the stars, I mean." Kieran's mouth quirked in that half-smile that was becoming familiar. Perhaps we can ride up there sometime when you're settled at the school." 3 days before the start of the school term, Emma declared the cabin ready for habitation. "Thomas and I can move in tomorrow," she announced at dinner. "Everything's prepared." An awkward silence fell over the table. James, oblivious to the tension, continued chattering about a frog he'd found near the creek, but the adults exchanged uneasy glances. "Are you certain?" Margaret finally asked. "There's no rush, Emma. Winter will be here before we know it, and that cabin can get mighty cold." "I've stocked plenty of firewood," Kieran added, "but Maggie's right. The first snow could come as early as October." Emma set down her fork, touched by their concern but determined to establish her independence. "I appreciate your hospitality more than I can express. But I need to stand on my own feet. The school board hired me understanding I'd live in the teacher's cabin, and I intend to honor that arrangement." Kieran studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I understand. But our offer stands anytime the weather's bad or you need help. This house is open to you and Thomas." "Thank you," Emma said softly, meeting his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that had been building over the past 2 weeks. The next morning, Kieran loaded Emma's carpetbag and Thomas's belongings into the wagon. Margaret had tears in her eyes as she kissed the baby goodbye. "You bring him to visit often," she instructed Emma, tucking a blanket around Thomas. "James will miss him terribly." "We'll see you every day," Emma promised. "You're still watching him during school hours, remember?" This reminder brightened Margaret's mood considerably. "Of course, and you'll both come for Sunday dinners. We'd be delighted," Emma assured her. The ride to town was quieter than usual, with Kieran seemingly lost in thought and Emma feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation about this new chapter. Thomas dozed in her arms, bundled against the morning chill. "Will you be all right?" Kieran finally asked as they approached the schoolhouse. "Truly," Emma nodded. "I will. This is what I came to Montana for: a fresh start, independence, a chance to build something for myself and Thomas." Kieran helped her unload her belongings, carrying them into the cabin and ensuring the stove was properly lit. He checked the woodpile once more, promising to send more before the first snow. "I should head back," he said finally, lingering in the doorway. "Ranch won't run itself." "Of course." Emma stood awkwardly, Thomas balanced on her hip. "Thank you again, Mr. Armstrong, for everything." "Kieran," he corrected gently. "After sharing a home for 2 weeks, I think we can use first names, don't you?" Emma smiled. "Kieran, then, and I'm Emma." "Emma," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "It suits you." He stepped forward suddenly, reaching out to touch Thomas's cheek with unexpected tenderness. "You be good for your mama, little man," he murmured. "I'll see you soon." Then, before Emma could respond, Kieran tipped his hat and was gone, boots crunching on the gravel path that led back to his wagon. Emma stood in the doorway, watching until his wagon disappeared from view. Only then did she turn back to survey her new home, feeling simultaneously proud of her independence and strangely bereft at the departure of the man who had so unexpectedly become important to her. "Well, Thomas," she said to the baby, who was now wide awake and staring around the unfamiliar surroundings, "this is our home now. What do you think?" Thomas responded with a gurgle that Emma chose to interpret as approval. She settled him on a blanket on the floor with a wooden rattle, then began unpacking their few possessions, determined to make this simple cabin into a proper home. The next day, children and parents gathered at the schoolhouse to meet their new teacher. Emma stood nervously at the door in her most professional attire, greeting each family and memorizing names. There were 23 students in total, ranging from 5-year-old Sally Jenkins to 16-year-old Will Thompson, the mayor's son. Parents eyed her with cautious optimism, some openly curious about the baby who lay in a basket behind Emma's desk. Thomas, thankfully, remained asleep throughout the introductions. "Miss Roberts was a teacher in Boston," Mayor Thompson informed the assembled families proudly, as if he'd personally recruited her from the East. "Our children will benefit greatly from her experience and education." As families dispersed, promising to return the following morning for the official start of term, Margaret arrived to collect Thomas. "How did it go?" she asked, carefully lifting the still sleeping baby. "Well, I think," Emma replied. "The children seem eager, though I suspect the older boys may test my authority." Margaret nodded knowingly. "Will Thompson and the Donovan boys, I imagine. They're good lads at heart, just full of energy and mischief." "Any advice?" Emma asked, walking Margaret to the door. "Be firm from the start," Margaret counseled. "They respect strength, and perhaps give Will some special responsibilities. He's bright but bored." Emma thanked her, then watched as Margaret carried Thomas toward Kieran's wagon, which was parked across the street. Kieran himself stood talking with several ranchers, but his gaze shifted to Emma as she appeared in the schoolhouse doorway. He raised a hand in greeting, and she returned the gesture, conscious of the many eyes watching this exchange. That night, alone in her cabin for the first time, Emma found it difficult to sleep. The unfamiliar sounds of the night, distant coyotes, the creaking of the cabin's timbers, the whisper of wind through the trees behind the schoolhouse kept her alert and slightly anxious. Without Thomas's steady breathing to lull her, Margaret had insisted on keeping him overnight since she would be watching him during school hours anyway. The cabin felt emptier than Emma had anticipated. She thought of the Armstrong ranch, with its warm kitchen and comfortable parlor, Margaret's cheerful presence and Kieran's steady reliability. In just 2 weeks, she had grown accustomed to being part of their household, sharing meals and conversations, watching Thomas bond with James under Margaret's watchful eye. "This is what you wanted," she reminded herself firmly. "Independence, a fresh start." Still, as she finally drifted toward sleep, Emma couldn't help but wonder if independence necessarily meant being alone. The school term began successfully, with Emma quickly establishing herself as a competent, fair-minded teacher who expected diligence but rewarded effort. As Margaret had predicted, the older boys tested her initially with whispers and pranks, but Emma's calm authority and willingness to engage their interests, particularly in mathematics and natural sciences, soon won them over. Each morning, Kieran or Margaret would bring Thomas to the cabin before school, and each afternoon, Emma would collect him from the Armstrong ranch. On days when Kieran came to town, he often lingered to help Emma with small repairs around the cabin or to split additional firewood for her growing pile. "Winter's coming," he would say when she protested that he was doing too much. "Better to be prepared." As September gave way to October, the air grew increasingly sharp, and the first frost silvered the grass one morning. Emma began wearing her heaviest coat to school and ensuring Thomas was bundled in layers for his daily journeys between town and the ranch. One Friday afternoon in mid-October, Emma arrived at the Armstrong ranch to find Margaret alone with the children, her expression worried. "Kieran's not back yet," she explained as Emma settled at the kitchen table, gratefully accepting a cup of hot tea. "He and 2 hands rode out to the north pasture yesterday to check on some strays. They should have returned by noon." Emma frowned, glancing out the window at the gathering clouds. "Could they have been delayed?" "Possibly," Margaret conceded, but her tension was evident as she sliced bread for sandwiches with more force than necessary. "But Kieran knows a storm is coming. He wouldn't stay out unless something was wrong." As if on cue, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Thomas, playing on a blanket with James, looked up at the sound. "Perhaps we should stay until he returns," Emma suggested, trying to keep her voice casual despite the concern blooming in her chest. "Thomas is comfortable here, and I'd worry about you alone if the storm worsens." Relief flooded Margaret's face. "Would you? I'd be grateful for the company." They spent the afternoon trying to distract themselves with domestic tasks, Emma helping Margaret preserve the last of the garden's produce while the children napped. But as daylight began to fade and the wind continued to strengthen, their worry intensified. "I should send word to Sheriff Davis," Margaret decided, reaching for her shawl. "One of the hands can ride to town." Before she could act on this plan, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard brought both women rushing to the door. Kieran dismounted slowly, his movements suggesting exhaustion. 2 ranch hands followed, leading a horse with what appeared to be a makeshift travois attached. Kieran. Margaret called, hurrying out despite the biting wind. What happened? Emma followed, clutching her shawl around her shoulders as she watched Kieran embrace his sister briefly. Found 3 strays up in the high pasture, he explained, his voice rough with fatigue. But Carlos took a fall when his horse spooked at a snake. Broken leg, I think. We splinted it as best we could. The injured ranch hand, a young Mexican man Emma had met briefly during her stay at the ranch, grimaced in pain as the other workers carefully lifted the travois. Bring him inside, Margaret directed immediately. Emma, can you fetch water to boil? And there's whiskey in the cabinet for the pain. The next hour passed in controlled chaos as they settled Carlos in the spare bedroom, the one Emma had occupied during her stay. Margaret, who had assisted the town doctor on numerous occasions, examined the injured leg while Kieran held a lamp for better light. Clean break, she pronounced finally. We've set it properly, but he'll need the doctor to check it tomorrow. He shouldn't be moved again tonight. I've sent Jake to fetch Doc Wilson, Kieran confirmed, looking relieved at his sister's assessment. He should be here by morning if the storm allows. Outside, the wind had intensified to a howl, and the first flakes of snow swirled past the windows. Emma, who had been keeping the children occupied in the kitchen, felt a flutter of anxiety as she realized the implications. We won't be able to return to town tonight, she said when Kieran joined her in the kitchen after settling Carlos. Kieran shook his head, pouring himself a cup of coffee with hands that betrayed a slight tremor of exhaustion. Not in this. Storm's coming in faster than expected, he glanced at her apologetically. I'm sorry, Emma. Looks like you and Thomas are stuck here for the night. It's no hardship, Emma assured him, surprised to realize how true this was. The cabin in town suddenly seemed very remote and cold compared to the warmth of the Armstrong kitchen. I'm just glad you made it back safely. Kieran's gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary. As am I. They ate a simple dinner together, with Margaret taking a tray to Carlos, who had been given whiskey for the pain and was now sleeping fitfully. After the meal, Kieran insisted on checking the animals one last time despite his evident exhaustion. He's dead on his feet, Margaret murmured as they watched him don his coat and hat. Been awake for nearly 2 days, riding hard with an injured man. He's remarkably dedicated, Emma observed. Margaret gave her a sidelong glance. That he is, to his ranch, his people. She paused meaningfully. To those he cares about. Emma felt her cheeks warm under Margaret's knowing look. He's been very kind to Thomas and me. Margaret hummed noncommittally. Kieran's always been kind, but I've never seen him chop quite so much firewood for anyone else's cabin. Before Emma could formulate a response, Kieran returned, stomping snow from his boots. All secured, he reported, but that snow's coming down hard now, first real storm of the season. The children were put to bed in James's room with Thomas in his old crib. Margaret retired to her bedroom, needing to check on Carlos periodically through the night. This left Emma and Kieran alone in the parlor, where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. You should rest, Emma told him, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes. You've had an exhausting ordeal. Kieran eased himself into an armchair with a sigh of relief. Soon, just need to warm up first. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire's warmth and the storm's muffled howling creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. Emma found herself studying Kieran's profile, the strong line of his jaw now darkened with stubble. The furrow between his brows that spoke of concern for his injured worker, the way his hands, capable and strong, rested on the arms of the chair. Tell me about Boston, Kieran said suddenly, his voice low and tired but interested. What was your life like there? Emma smiled, drawing her feet up beneath her on the sofa. Busy, crowded, full of noise and people and activity. She paused, considering. I taught at the Fairmont School for young ladies, helping with grammar and composition mostly. The headmistress was strict but fair. The girls came from wealthy families, many preparing for advantageous marriages. And were you preparing for such a marriage? Emma shook her head. No. My father was a clerk, my mother a seamstress. We were respectable but not wealthy. I expected to teach until she hesitated. Until, Kieran prompted gently, until I met someone, Emma admitted. I had romantic notions of falling in love despite the practical realities of my situation. Then Caroline died, leaving Thomas in my care, and everything changed. Kieran nodded thoughtfully, and Edwin Porter's advertisement seemed like a solution. Yes, Emma agreed. His letters were kind, intelligent. He wrote of building a life together in Montana, said he didn't mind that Thomas wasn't my natural child. She sighed. I thought we might develop genuine affection over time. A practical arrangement with hope for more, Kieran summarized, his eyes on the fire. Not so different from what I suggested that night after the school board meeting. Emma's heart quickened at the direct reference to his almost proposal. No, she agreed softly, not so different. Kieran's gaze shifted to her face, something unreadable in his expression. Emma, whatever he intended to say, was interrupted by Margaret's appearance in the doorway, her face tight with concern. Carlos's fever is rising, she reported. I've given him willow bark tea, but I'm worried about infection. Kieran rose immediately, fatigue forgotten. I'll sit with him. You've been up as long as I have, Maggie. We can take turns, Margaret suggested. All three of us. That way no one has to stay awake all night. And so they established a rotation, with each taking 2 hours to monitor Carlos while the others rested. Emma insisted Kieran sleep first, given his exhaustion from the rescue journey. Margaret took the second watch, and Emma the third, which began at midnight. The house was utterly silent as Emma slipped into the sick room, carrying a lamp turned low. Carlos slept restlessly, his skin hot to the touch when Emma placed a cool cloth on his forehead. She settled into a chair beside the bed, prepared for a long vigil. An hour into her watch, the bedroom door opened quietly and Kieran appeared, barefoot and wearing only trousers and an undershirt, his hair mussed from sleep. Everything all right, he whispered, coming to stand beside her. His fever's still high, but no worse, Emma reported, equally quiet. You should be sleeping. Couldn't, Kieran admitted. Too much on my mind. He leaned down to check Carlos himself, his face grave as he felt the young man's burning skin. He's strong, he'll pull through. You care deeply for your workers, Emma observed. They're my responsibility, Kieran replied simply, as if this explained everything. Perhaps, Emma reflected, for him it did. He straightened, then surprised her by pulling up a second chair. I'll sit with you a while if that's all right. Of course. They maintained their quiet vigil side by side, occasionally speaking in hushed tones, but mostly sharing a comfortable silence. Outside, the storm continued to rage, wind whistling around the eaves of the house, and snow accumulating against the windows. Inside, the sick room was warm, intimate, the lamplight casting a golden glow over their faces. I never asked, Kieran said after a long silence, why you kept Thomas. It couldn't have been an easy decision. Emma smiled sadly, her gaze on the sleeping Carlos but her thoughts elsewhere. Caroline was my dearest friend since childhood. When she learned she was with child, her family disowned her. The father, a visiting professor at the university, denied any responsibility and returned to England. She shook her head at the memory. I was with her when Thomas was born. When she knew she wouldn't survive, she asked me to raise him as my own. That took courage, Kieran observed. You must have known how it would complicate your life. I did, Emma acknowledged, but I loved Caroline, and from the moment I held Thomas, I loved him too. How could I abandon him? Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's why I offered to help raise him that first day at the depot. I recognized something in you, a determination to do right by that child, no matter the cost. And now, Emma asked softly, now that you know us better. Kieran's gaze met hers, steady and certain in the lamplight. Now I'm even more convinced it was the right decision, for all of us. The implication in his words hung between them, delicate as gossamer. Emma found herself unable to look away from his face, from the earnestness in his blue eyes and the gentle curve of his mouth. A sudden moan from Carlos broke the moment, calling them both back to their duty. Together they tended to the sick man, Emma holding him up while Kieran helped him drink more willow bark tea. When Carlos settled again, his breathing slightly easier, they resumed their seats, now drawn imperceptibly closer together. "When the storm passes," Kieran said quietly, "and Carlos is on the mend, would you consider spending more time here at the ranch, you and Thomas both?" Emma hesitated, unsure of his meaning. "For visits, you mean?" Kieran shook his head slightly. "For more than that, perhaps." "The cabin in town is small and winter is harsh here. The schoolhouse is close enough to walk to in good weather and I could drive you in bad." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "What I'm trying to say, poorly, is that I'd like us to consider a more permanent arrangement." Emma's pulse quickened. "Are you proposing again, Kieran Armstrong?" A smile touched his lips. "I believe I am, Emma Roberts, though with more thought behind it this time." He reached across the space between them to take her hand. "These past weeks, watching you with Thomas, seeing your strength and kindness, I find myself thinking of you both as family already." Emma looked down at their joined hands, his large and work-roughened, hers smaller but equally capable. "This isn't how I imagined it would happen," she admitted. "Sitting in a sick room during a snowstorm." "Life rarely happens as we imagine," Kieran replied, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "but sometimes it's better for the surprise of it." Emma met his gaze again, finding sincerity and something deeper there, something that made her heart expand with unexpected warmth. "I came to Montana to marry a stranger," she said softly. "But you're not a stranger anymore, are you?" "No," Kieran agreed, his voice equally soft. "I don't believe I am. If I say yes," Emma continued carefully, "I want us both to understand that this isn't merely a practical arrangement. There would need to be genuine feeling between us." Kieran's grip on her hand tightened slightly. "Emma, I assure you, my feelings for you are entirely genuine and growing stronger each day." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver of pleasure through her. "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Kieran Armstrong." His smile bloomed slowly, transforming his tired face into something so handsome it made Emma's breath catch. "May I kiss you? Properly this time?" Emma nodded, her heart thundering in her chest as Kieran leaned forward. His lips met hers gently at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. It was a kiss of promise and discovery, sweet and unhurried despite the unlikely setting. When they finally parted, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "Not how I planned it," he murmured, "but I'll take it." A soft cough from the doorway startled them both. Margaret stood there, her expression a mixture of amusement and approval. "My turn to watch," she said, entering the room with exaggerated casualness. "Though it seems you two have been busy." Emma blushed furiously, but Kieran merely grinned, keeping hold of her hand as they rose from their chairs. "Maggie, I've asked Emma to marry me," he announced, pride evident in his voice. "She's said yes." Margaret's composure broke into a beaming smile. "Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think I'd need to lock you two in the root cellar to get you to admit your feelings." "You knew?" Emma asked, surprised. "My dear," Margaret laughed softly, mindful of their patient. "Everyone knew, the way you two look at each other. It was only a matter of time." Kieran squeezed Emma's hand. "Get some rest," he told her. "Morning will be here soon enough and we have plans to make." As Emma settled into her borrowed bed that night, the storm still raging outside but her heart utterly calm, she thought about the strange path that had led her to this moment. She had come to Willow Creek as a mail-order bride, been left alone at the depot with a baby in her arms, and found herself embarking on an entirely different journey than the one she'd planned. Yet somehow, lying in the darkness of the Armstrong home with Thomas sleeping peacefully nearby and the knowledge of Kieran's love warming her from within, Emma knew with absolute certainty that she had arrived exactly where she was meant to be. The snowstorm raged for 2 days, blanketing Willow Creek and the surrounding countryside in a pristine layer of white. Dr. Wilson arrived the morning after the proposal, having made his way to the Armstrong ranch despite the treacherous conditions. He confirmed Margaret's assessment of Carlos's broken leg, praised their treatment, and prescribed continued rest and care. "The fever's concerning," he admitted, "but it's already responding to Margaret's ministrations. Keep doing what you're doing and he should recover fully." With the roads impassable and school necessarily canceled, Emma and Thomas remained at the ranch. The forced confinement created a sort of honeymoon period for the newly engaged couple, allowing them time together that might otherwise have been difficult to arrange. Kieran took Emma on a tour of the ranch house, showing her rooms she hadn't seen during her initial stay, including his own bedroom, a surprisingly comfortable space with bookshelves lining one wall and a large window overlooking the mountains. "This would be ours," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice as Emma examined the room. "Unless you'd prefer your own space, some wives do." Emma turned to him with a smile. "I think we'll do quite well sharing," she said, enjoying the flush that rose to his cheeks at her words. They spent the snowy days planning their future together. Kieran showed Emma the ranch's account books, explaining the operation's finances with the transparency of a true partnership. Emma shared her ideas for the school, her hopes of expanding the library and perhaps eventually adding a second classroom as the town grew. Most importantly, they discussed Thomas and their vision for raising him together. "He'll need your name on official papers," Emma said one evening as they sat before the fire, Thomas asleep in her lap. "If you're to be his father legally as well as in practice." Kieran nodded thoughtfully. "We can speak to Judge Harmon when he makes his circuit through Willow Creek next month. He can draw up adoption papers along with our marriage certificate." "You've thought this through," Emma observed, touched by his thorough consideration. "I try to be prepared," Kieran replied with a smile. "It's kept me alive in Montana winters." On the third day, the storm finally abated, leaving behind a transformed landscape of gleaming white drifts and ice crystal trees that sparkled in the returning sunlight. Kieran and his men cleared paths to the barn and outbuildings, while Emma and Margaret attended to Carlos, whose fever had broken overnight. "School will have to remain closed for at least another day," Kieran said when he returned from checking the road to town. "Drifts are waist-high in places." "The children won't mind the holiday," Emma laughed, "though I'll need to adjust my lesson plans." That evening after dinner, Kieran surprised Emma by producing a small velvet pouch from his pocket. "I've been saving this," he explained as they sat together in the parlor, the others having tactfully retired early. "It was my mother's." He emptied the pouch into his palm, revealing a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically, "but it's been in the family for generations." "It's beautiful," Emma breathed, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Your mother would be pleased, I think. She would have loved you," Kieran said with certainty, taking Emma's left hand. "Emma Roberts, will you wear this ring as a symbol of our engagement and marry me as soon as arrangements can be made?" "I will," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the emotion welling in her chest. "With all my heart." The ring fit perfectly, its weight unfamiliar but welcome on her finger. Emma admired it in the firelight, then leaned forward to kiss Kieran softly. "When shall we marry? How soon can Reverend Collins be available?" Kieran asked, only half joking. At Emma's laugh, he continued more seriously, "I'd thought perhaps before Christmas." "That gives us nearly 2 months to prepare, and we could have a proper celebration with the whole community." "Christmas would be lovely," Emma agreed, "and it gives me time to make a suitable dress." "You'd be beautiful in a flower sack," Kieran assured her, earning another laugh and a playful swat on the arm. "Charming as that image may be, Mr. Armstrong, I think I'll aim for something slightly more elegant for my wedding day." The next morning, the road to town was finally passable, and Kieran prepared the sleigh to take Emma and Thomas back to the cabin. As she gathered their belongings, Emma realized how quickly the ranch had become home again, how natural it felt to move through its rooms, to share meals at its table, to fall asleep knowing Kieran was nearby. "You could stay," Margaret suggested, watching Emma pack Thomas's things. "No one would think anything of it, given the circumstances." "The circumstances being that we're engaged, not married," Emma reminded her with a smile. "And while Willow Creek may be more forgiving than Boston society, I am still the schoolteacher. I should maintain certain standards of propriety." Margaret sighed dramatically, So practical, you and Kieran are perfectly matched in that regard. Not entirely practical, Emma demurred, touching the engagement ring that now adorned her finger. I find myself quite romantically inclined these days, Margaret laughed delightedly. I never thought I'd see the day my stoic brother would make a woman's eyes sparkle so. It suits you both. As promised, Kieran drove Emma and Thomas to town in the sleigh, the runners gliding smoothly over the packed snow. The cabin, when they arrived, was cold and dark, but Kieran quickly built a roaring fire in the stove while Emma settled Thomas. I'll bring more wood tomorrow, he promised, warming his hands at the growing blaze, and check on you after school. We'll be fine, Emma assured him, though the cabin seemed smaller and lonelier than she remembered after the warmth and company of the ranch. Kieran watched her move around the cabin, unpacking their things with efficient grace. 2 months, he said suddenly. 2 months until Christmas, and then you won't have to come back here after school. You'll come home, to our home. The possessive warmth in his voice made Emma pause her unpacking to look at him. Our home, she repeated softly, testing the words. I like the sound of that. Kieran crossed to her in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms with newfound confidence. As do I, he murmured before claiming her lips in a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. When he finally released her, Emma's cheeks were flushed and her heart racing. You should go, she said reluctantly. Before the light fades, Kieran nodded, equally reluctant. I'll see you tomorrow. After he left, Emma stood in the center of the cabin, Thomas babbling contentedly on his blanket, and thought about how completely her life had transformed in the span of a month. From desolation at the depot to engagement to a man, she was rapidly falling in love with. It seemed almost miraculous. Your mama came to Montana seeking a husband, she told Thomas as she prepared his evening bottle. And though he wasn't the one I expected to find, I believe he may be exactly the one we needed. Word of the engagement spread quickly through Willow Creek, with reactions ranging from delight, Mayor Thompson. Excellent match, knew it from the moment you arrived, to resignation, Sheriff Davis. Well, Armstrong's a good man, treats his stock fair, pays his taxes on time. Emma's students were particularly excited, peppering her with questions about the wedding and whether they would be invited. Mr. Armstrong said we can have the celebration at the ranch, she explained to her curious class. Everyone in Willow Creek will be welcome to attend. Will you still be our teacher after you're married? Asked 10-year-old Lucy Peterson anxiously. Of course, Emma assured her. Mrs. Armstrong will teach just as Miss Roberts did. This answer seemed to satisfy most of the children, though Will Thompson couldn't resist adding, My pa says you'll probably have babies of your own soon, and then you won't want to teach anymore. Emma managed to maintain her composure despite the heat rising to her face. Your father is entitled to his opinion, Will, but I assure you, I plan to continue teaching for many years to come. As November progressed, preparations for the wedding occupied much of Emma's free time. Margaret helped her select fabric for her wedding dress, a rich cream wool with delicate lace trim, and the women of Willow Creek took turns assisting with the sewing during afternoon gatherings at the boarding house. Kieran, meanwhile, was overseeing the construction of an addition to the ranch house, a nursery adjacent to the master bedroom for Thomas, with space for future children. He visited Emma and Thomas nearly every day, often bringing small gifts. A jar of honey from the hives on the south side of the property, a handcrafted wooden toy for Thomas, a book of poetry he'd ordered from Denver. Each gesture, each thoughtful word or touch drew Emma's heart closer to his. What had begun as a practical arrangement was blossoming into genuine love, deeper and more satisfying than anything she had imagined when answering Edwin Porter's advertisement. Thomas, too, was flourishing. Now approaching 6 months old, he had mastered rolling over and was attempting to sit up on his own. He greeted Kieran's arrivals with excited kicks and gurgles, clearly recognizing and adoring the man who would soon be his father. One particularly cold evening in late November, Kieran arrived at the cabin just as Emma was putting Thomas down for the night. He waited patiently in the main room, warming himself by the stove until she emerged from the tiny bedroom. "He's asleep already?" Kieran asked, removing his hat and coat. "The cold makes him drowsy," Emma explained, accepting Kieran's quick kiss in greeting. "He'll be up before dawn, though, eager for his breakfast." Kieran smiled, settling into one of the two chairs at Emma's small table. "I've been thinking about Christmas," he said, watching as Emma prepared tea for them both. "I'd like us to marry on Christmas Eve, if that suits you. Then we could have the celebration that night, and Christmas Day would be our first full day as husband and wife." "Christmas Eve would be perfect," Emma agreed, placing a steaming cup before him. "The school term will have ended and everyone will be in a festive mood." "I've spoken to Reverend Collins," Kieran continued. "He's happy to perform the ceremony at the ranch. Margaret's already planning the feast. I think half the cattle in Montana will be required to feed everyone she intends to invite." Emma laughed, enjoying the way Kieran's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Your sister is determined that this wedding be memorable." "Speaking of memorable," Kieran said, his expression growing more serious, "there's something I'd like to give you, an early wedding gift." From his pocket, he withdrew a folded document which he placed on the table between them. Emma picked it up curiously, unfolding the official-looking paper. As she read, her eyes widened in surprise. "Kieran, this is the deed to the schoolteacher's cabin." He nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "Mayor Thompson mentioned that the town council was considering selling it, now that the new schoolhouse is being planned with larger living quarters for the teacher. I bought it." "But why?" Emma asked, confused. "We'll be living at the ranch after the wedding." "For Thomas," Kieran explained. "When he's grown, it's deeded to him, with you and me as trustees until he's of age." He reached across to take her hand. "I want him to have something that's truly his, a starting place when he's ready to make his own way in the world." Emma stared at the document, then at the man across from her, emotion welling in her throat. "This is incredibly thoughtful." "I promised to raise him," Kieran said simply. "This is part of that promise." Setting the deed aside, Emma rose and moved around the table to where Kieran sat. Without hesitation, she settled onto his lap, winding her arms around his neck. "I love you, Kieran Armstrong," she whispered, the words coming naturally despite it being the first time she had spoken them aloud. "I love you for your kindness, your strength, and your extraordinary heart." Kieran's arms tightened around her waist, his eyes reflecting both surprise and joy at her declaration. "And I love you, Emma Roberts, more than I ever thought possible." Their kiss was deeper than previous ones, infused with the certainty of their feelings and the promise of their future together. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. 24 more days," he murmured, "then I won't have to leave you here each night." 24 days, Emma echoed, her heart full to bursting with happiness. "I'll count everyone." As December arrived, bringing with it even colder temperatures and occasional snow flurries, excitement for the approaching wedding grew throughout Willow Creek. Emma's students presented her with a handmade quilt, each child having contributed a square with their name embroidered on it. The women of the town organized a wedding shower, presenting Emma with household items and practical gifts for her new life as Mrs. Armstrong. Meanwhile, at the ranch, the addition was completed just in time, with Thomas's nursery painted and furnished with a new crib crafted by Kieran himself. Margaret transformed the house with festive decorations, pine boughs, red ribbons, and candles that would serve for both Christmas and the wedding celebration. A week before the wedding, Emma closed the school for the winter break with a small party for her students. As the children departed, cheeks rosy with excitement for both Christmas and their teacher's wedding, Emma remained behind to tidy the classroom. She was arranging books on the shelf when the door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and Sheriff Davis. The lawman removed his hat, revealing graying hair and a solemn expression. "Miss Roberts," he greeted her formally. "Got a moment, of course, Sheriff," Emma replied, curious about his unexpected visit. "Is everything all right?" Davis shifted uncomfortably. "Got some news you should hear before the wedding. Thought it best coming from me official-like." Emma's heart skipped anxiously. "What is it?" "Received a telegram from Boston yesterday. Man named Richard Blackwell's been inquiring about your whereabouts." Davis pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "Says he's the father of the child in your care and he's claiming his rights." Emma sank into her chair, blood draining from her face. "Richard Blackwell," she whispered. "Caroline's professor." Davis nodded grimly. "He claims he never knew about the child until recently. Says he wants to meet his son." "No," Emma said firmly, rising again with sudden strength. "He abandoned Caroline when she needed him most. He has no rights to Thomas." "Madam, I understand your feelings, but legally, Thomas is my ward," Emma interrupted. "Caroline's will named me his guardian, and Kieran and I are adopting him formally after our wedding." Her voice shook slightly. "Richard Blackwell cannot simply appear after 6 months and claim a child he's never even seen." Davis sighed heavily. "I thought you'd say that, and for what it's worth, I agree with you, but I thought you should know the telegram said he's traveling west. Might arrive in Willow Creek as early as next week." Emma's mind raced. "The wedding is in 6 days. Might be wise to move it up," Davis suggested carefully. "Once you and Armstrong are married and the adoption papers are filed, your position would be stronger." Emma nodded slowly, a plan forming. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff. I need to speak with Kieran immediately." "I can drive you out to the ranch," Davis offered. "My deputy's watching the office." Grateful for his assistance, Emma quickly gathered her things and followed the sheriff to his waiting buggy. During the journey to the Armstrong ranch, she sat in tense silence, mind whirling with implications. Richard Blackwell had been charming and persuasive qualities that had won Caroline's heart before breaking it. Emma had met him only briefly, but she'd witnessed the aftermath of his callous abandonment. The thought of him claiming any rights to Thomas filled her with dread. Kieran was in the barn when they arrived, discussing the spring breeding program with his foreman. One look at Emma's face, however, and he immediately excused himself, crossing quickly to her side. "What's happened?" he asked, his hand finding hers instinctively. Sheriff Davis explained the situation concisely while Emma fought to maintain her composure. As the implications became clear, Kieran's expression hardened into determined resolve. "He has no legal claim," Kieran stated flatly. "Caroline's will named Emma guardian, and we're adopting Thomas after the wedding." "That's what I told the sheriff," Emma agreed, drawing strength from Kieran's certainty. "But he suggested we might move the wedding forward to strengthen our position before Richard arrives." Kieran nodded decisively. "We'll marry tomorrow. I'll speak to Reverend Collins immediately." "Tomorrow," Emma echoed, startled by the suddenness of the decision. "Unless you want to wait," Kieran said, his voice softening as he studied her face. "This isn't how we planned it, I know." Emma squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding. "No, tomorrow is perfect. The sooner we're married and the adoption papers are filed, the safer Thomas will be." "I'll ride into town now to inform the Reverend," Sheriff Davis volunteered. "No need to make a fuss about the reason for the change. Folks will understand." After the sheriff departed, Kieran led Emma into the house, where Margaret was preparing dinner with Thomas contentedly playing nearby. At the sight of her baby, Emma's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she gathered him into her arms. "Emma, what's wrong?" Margaret asked, alarmed. Kieran explained the situation while Emma held Thomas close, inhaling the sweet scent of his hair and feeling the solid weight of him against her shoulder. The thought of losing him to Richard Blackwell was unbearable. "We're moving the wedding to tomorrow," Kieran concluded. "It's short notice, but say no more," Margaret interrupted, already untying her apron. "I'll send the hands to notify everyone. The food's mostly prepared anyway, we'll just have fewer decorations than planned." She looked at Emma kindly. "What about your dress? Is it finished?" "Almost," Emma replied, her voice steadier now. "The final fitting was scheduled for tomorrow, but I can manage without it." "Nonsense," Margaret declared. "I'll send for Mrs. Jenkins and the sewing circle now. They can work through the night if necessary." What followed was a whirlwind of activity as Willow Creek mobilized around the suddenly accelerated wedding plans. By nightfall, Everyone had been notified of the change, Mrs. Jenkins and 3 other women had arrived to complete Emma's dress, and Reverend Collins had confirmed his availability for a ceremony at noon the following day. Through it all, Kieran remained a steady presence at Emma's side, his quiet confidence reassuring her that they would face whatever came together. When she finally prepared to return to her cabin for her last night as Emma Roberts, he walked her to Sheriff Davis's buggy, which would transport her home. "I wish you could stay here tonight," he said quietly, holding her close, "but tomorrow nothing will separate us again." "Tomorrow," Emma agreed, lifting her face for his kiss, "and then we'll ensure Thomas's future is secure." "I promise you, Emma," Kieran vowed, his voice low and intense, "Richard Blackwell will never take Thomas from us. Whatever we must do, whatever battle we must fight, that child is ours." The certainty in his declaration wrapped around Emma's heart like a protective shield. With a final kiss goodbye, she climbed into the buggy, Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms, and began the journey to town for her last night in the teacher's cabin. Dawn broke clear and cold on Emma's wedding day, the rising sun casting pink and gold streaks across the snow-covered landscape. She woke early, having slept little due to both excitement and anxiety. Thomas, sensing her restlessness, was unusually fussy, requiring extra attention as she prepared for the most important day of their lives. Mrs. Holloway arrived shortly after breakfast, accompanied by her daughter and 3 other women from the sewing circle. They bustled into the small cabin, arms laden with Emma's completed wedding dress, flowers preserved from the town's last greenhouse, and various items for Emma's hair and appearance. "No bride should prepare alone, Mrs. Holloway declared, taking charge of Thomas while the others laid out their supplies. "Especially not one as deserving of happiness as you, my dear." Emma surrendered to their ministrations gratefully, allowing herself to be bathed, dressed, and adorned as the women chattered around her. Mrs. Jenkins's daughter, Mary, proved particularly skilled with hair, arranging Emma's auburn locks in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers and a delicate veil borrowed from Margaret's own wedding. When Emma finally stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, she hardly recognized the woman reflected back at her. The cream wool dress fit perfectly, its high collar and fitted bodice giving way to a modestly flared skirt. The lace trim at the wrists and collar added a touch of delicacy, while the sapphire pendant, another loan from Margaret, serving as something borrowed and blue, gleamed at her throat. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Holloway said softly, standing behind Emma with Thomas in her arms. The baby stared at his mother with wide, curious eyes, seemingly fascinated by her transformed appearance. "Thank you," Emma whispered, emotion threatening to overcome her composure. "All of you, for making this day possible despite the rushed circumstances." "Nonsense, Mrs. Jenkins said briskly, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "We're simply honored to be part of such a love story. Kieran Armstrong rescuing you and this little one at the depot, taking you in, falling in love. It's the sort of tale people will tell for generations in Willow Creek." Emma smiled, thinking of how differently the story might have unfolded had Edwin Porter lived, or had Kieran not happened to be at the depot that September afternoon. "Sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones we never plan to tell," she reflected. At precisely 11 o'clock, Sheriff Davis arrived with his best buggy, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the occasion. He assisted Emma and Thomas into the vehicle, handling both bride and baby with unexpected gentleness. "You look mighty fine, Miss Roberts," he said gruffly as he arranged a warm blanket around them. "Armstrong's a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Emma replied sincerely. "Kieran and Willow Creek have given us a home when we needed it most." The journey to the Armstrong ranch passed in a blur of anticipation for Emma. Thomas, dressed in a new outfit sewn by Margaret, remained remarkably content, as if he too understood the significance of the day. As they approached the ranch, Emma could see dozens of horses and wagons already gathered, indicating that despite the short notice, most of Willow Creek had assembled to witness the union. The house and yard had been transformed with evergreen garlands and red ribbons, creating a festive atmosphere that belied the urgency behind the accelerated celebration. Margaret met them at the door, resplendent in a deep blue dress, her face alight with happiness. "He's waiting for you," she told Emma, taking Thomas from her arms. "In the parlor with Reverend Collins and half the town squeezed in to witness." Emma took a steadying breath, smoothing her skirts nervously. "How do I look?" Margaret's eyes shone with tears as she beheld her soon-to-be sister-in-law. "Like you belong here," she said simply. "Like you always have." With Sheriff Davis escorting her in lieu of a father, Emma entered the parlor to find it transformed. Furniture had been moved to create an aisle leading to the fireplace, where Kieran stood waiting beside Reverend Collins. Crowded into the room were what seemed like all of Willow Creek's residents, their faces turning toward her with smiles and murmurs of appreciation. But Emma saw only Kieran. He stood tall and proud in a new black suit, his usually unruly hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. As their eyes met across the room, his expression transformed from nervous anticipation to pure joy, and Emma felt her heart expand with love for this man who had changed her life so completely. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with Reverend Collins speaking eloquently of commitment, partnership, and the sacred bond of marriage. When it came time for vows, Kieran took Emma's hands in his voice clear and steady as he promised to love, honor, and protect her and Thomas for all their days. Emma's own voice trembled slightly as she repeated her vows, emotion welling in her throat as she pledged herself to Kieran. When he slipped the gold band, a companion to her engagement ring, onto her finger, she felt as though their connection was being sealed, unbreakable and eternal. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Collins proclaimed, "and before this company of witnesses, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He smiled broadly at Kieran. "You may kiss your bride." Kieran needed no further encouragement. Drawing Emma into his arms, he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his feelings, eliciting cheers and applause from the assembled guests. "Mrs. Armstrong," he whispered against her lips as they parted, "welcome home." The celebration that followed was joyous despite its hasty arrangement. Margaret had worked miracles with the food preparation, ensuring a feast worthy of both a wedding and Christmas. Tables were set up throughout the house and on the covered porch, allowing guests to mingle freely. Music was provided by a local fiddler and Kieran himself, who was persuaded to play his harmonica for several lively dances. Throughout it all, Emma moved in a state of heightened awareness, conscious that this day, originally planned for Christmas Eve, but now unfolding with its own perfect timing, marked the true beginning of her life in Montana. No longer was she a mail-order bride left at the depot, or a schoolteacher living alone with an adopted baby. She was Emma Armstrong, wife of Kieran, mother to Thomas, and a full-fledged member of the Willow Creek community. As afternoon faded into evening, guests gradually departed, leaving only the closest friends and family. Thomas, overwhelmed by the day's excitement, had fallen asleep in Margaret's bedroom, with James appointed as his self-important guardian. Kieran found Emma on the porch, gazing out at the star-filled sky. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, enveloping her in his warmth as they stood in companionable silence. "Any regrets," he asked quietly, "about rushing the wedding?" Emma leaned back against his chest, savoring the solid strength of him. "None whatsoever, though I must admit, I'm sorry we missed the opportunity to marry on Christmas Eve as planned." "We can still celebrate then," Kieran suggested, his breath warm against her ear. "A private renewal of vows, perhaps, just the two of us." Emma turned in his arms, looping her hands behind his neck. "I'd like that very much, but for now—" She glanced meaningfully toward the house, where only a few guests remained, engaged in conversation with Margaret. Kieran's eyes darkened with understanding. "Shall we make our excuses to our guests, Mrs. Armstrong?" "I believe that would be entirely appropriate, Mr. Armstrong," Emma agreed with a smile that held both invitation and promise. Later, in the privacy of what was now their shared bedroom, with Thomas sleeping peacefully in his new nursery nearby. Kieran and Emma consummated their marriage with a tenderness that gradually gave way to passion. Their bodies joined as their lives had, with initial hesitation, yielding to perfect harmony. Two people becoming one in the most intimate expression of their love. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts, the December night cold beyond their window but their shared bed deliciously warm, Emma traced the contours of Kieran's face with gentle fingers. "When I arrived in Willow Creek," she murmured, "I never imagined this would be my life. That I could be so completely, utterly happy." Kieran caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "When I saw you standing at that depot holding Thomas, something inside me recognized you both as mine, even then, before I knew you." He smiled, the moonlight from the window silvering his features. "I said I'd raise him, but the truth is, you've both raised me to a life fuller and richer than I ever thought possible." Emma's heart swelled with love for this man who had opened his home and heart to her and Thomas without hesitation. "Whatever challenges come," she vowed, thinking of Richard Blackwell's imminent arrival, "we'll face them together." "Together," Kieran agreed, pulling her close once more. "Always." 3 days after the wedding, as Emma was settling into her new role as mistress of the Armstrong household, a messenger arrived from town with news that Richard Blackwell had reached Willow Creek and was inquiring about Emma's whereabouts. "Sheriff Davis told him you'd married and were living at the Armstrong ranch," the young ranch hand reported. "Said the fellow seemed mighty surprised by that information." Kieran, who had been reviewing cattle tallies at the kitchen table, rose immediately. "Did the sheriff say what Blackwell intends?" The messenger shifted uncomfortably. "He's taken a room at the hotel, sir. Says he wants to meet with Mrs. Armstrong and discuss matters concerning the child." Emma exchanged a glance with Kieran, her stomach knotting with anxiety despite their preparation for this moment. Judge Harmon had arrived in Willow Creek the day after their wedding, and at Sheriff Davis's urging had expedited the adoption papers. Thomas was now legally Thomas Armstrong, their son in the eyes of the law. "Tell Sheriff Davis we'll receive Mr. Blackwell tomorrow morning," Kieran decided, his voice calm but his expression resolute. "Here at the ranch at 10 o'clock. After the messenger departed, Kieran pulled Emma into a reassuring embrace. "Remember, the law is on our side. Thomas is our son now, legally and in every way that matters." Emma nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his certainty. "I know, but Richard can be persuasive. And he's educated, well-connected." "So are you," Kieran reminded her, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. "And you have something he doesn't, genuine love for Thomas and a community that supports you." That night, Emma slept fitfully despite Kieran's comforting presence beside her. She rose before dawn to check on Thomas, finding reassurance in his peaceful sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "I won't let him take you," she whispered, stroking his soft cheek. "Your father and I will protect you always." The morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, the temperature having dropped overnight to well below freezing. Emma dressed with particular care, selecting a conservative blue dress that emphasized her role as both respectable schoolteacher and rancher's wife. Kieran, too, chose clothing that projected authority, not his usual work clothes, but not formal attire either. A statement that this was his home, his domain, and he was comfortable in it. At precisely 10 o'clock, Sheriff Davis arrived with Richard Blackwell. Emma, watching from the parlor window with Thomas in her arms, felt a jolt of recognition as the professor stepped down from the sheriff's buggy. He looked much as she remembered, tall and distinguished, with dark hair graying at the temples and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to deference. "Ready?" Kieran asked quietly, placing a supportive hand at the small of her back. Emma nodded, straightening her shoulders. "Ready." Sheriff Davis made the introductions as Margaret ushered the visitors into the parlor. Richard Blackwell's gaze immediately fixed on Thomas, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something Emma couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Armstrong," he greeted her with practiced courtesy. You're looking well. Married life in Montana seems to agree with you. It does, Emma replied evenly, conscious of Kieran standing protectively beside her. This is my husband, Kieran Armstrong. The men exchanged curt nods but no handshakes, the tension in the room palpable. Please sit down, Margaret offered, indicating the chairs arranged around the parlor. I'll bring coffee. Once they were seated, Emma and Kieran on the sofa with Thomas between them, Blackwell in an armchair opposite, and Sheriff Davis standing unobtrusively by the door, an awkward silence fell. I understand congratulations are in order, Blackwell finally said, not only on your recent marriage but also on your adoption of the child. Thomas, Emma supplied, her voice firmer than she felt. His name is Thomas Armstrong. Blackwell inclined his head in acknowledgement. Thomas, yes. After Caroline's father, I presume. The casual mention of Caroline's name from the man who had abandoned her stirred Emma's anger. Why are you here, Richard? After all this time, Blackwell sighed, accepting a cup of coffee from Margaret with a distracted nod of thanks. I only learned of Caroline's death and the existence of her child 2 months ago when I returned to Boston from an extended research trip abroad. By then, you had already departed for Montana. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. I felt responsible. I wanted to ensure the child was being properly cared for. Thomas is well loved and well provided for, Kieran stated, his tone brooking no argument. He's our son now, legally adopted with the blessing of the court. Blackwell's gaze sharpened. Yes, I understand the adoption was rather hastily arranged, just after your equally hasty wedding. Our marriage and Thomas's adoption were planned well before your arrival, Emma countered, though she knew the accusation held some truth. The timing was adjusted for personal reasons. I see. Blackwell set down his coffee cup, his expression turning more businesslike. Mrs. Armstrong, I won't pretend my behavior toward Caroline was admirable. I was facing a difficult situation, a married professor involved with a student, and I chose the coward's path. He paused, seeming to gather himself. But I am Thomas's natural father, and now that I know of his existence, I feel a responsibility toward him. A responsibility you didn't feel when Caroline told you she was expecting your child, Emma couldn't help retorting, her hands tightening around Thomas protectively. You're right, Blackwell conceded, surprising them with his frankness. I failed Caroline, and by extension, I failed Thomas, but I'm here now hoping to make amends. Make amends how? Kieran asked bluntly. Blackwell leaned forward, his gaze moving between Emma and Kieran with careful assessment. I'm not here to disrupt your lives or to challenge the adoption. Legally, I understand my position is tenuous at best, given Caroline's will and the court's decision. He paused. I simply want the opportunity to know my son, perhaps to contribute to his future in some meaningful way. Emma exchanged a surprised glance with Kieran. This was not the confrontation they had anticipated. What exactly are you proposing? Kieran asked, his tone still wary but less hostile. Visitation occasionally, letters certainly, and I'd like to establish a trust for his education. Blackwell's expression softened as he looked at Thomas, who was contentedly playing with a wooden toy in Emma's lap. He has Caroline's eyes. The observation, so simple and so true, struck Emma unexpectedly. Thomas did indeed have his mother's clear blue eyes, a fact Emma had noted from his earliest days. That Richard Blackwell would recognize this connection would see Caroline and their son humanized him in a way Emma hadn't expected. Why should we trust you? She asked, her voice quieter now. You abandoned Caroline when she needed you most. How do we know you won't disappear from Thomas's life just as easily? Blackwell nodded, accepting the challenge. A fair question. I can only say that losing Caroline, learning of her death months after it occurred, affected me profoundly. I realized too late what my cowardice had cost. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing an envelope. This is the deed to my property in Massachusetts, amended to include Thomas as beneficiary upon my death. A tangible commitment to his future, regardless of my involvement in his life. Sheriff Davis stepped forward, accepting the envelope from Blackwell and examining its contents before passing it to Kieran. Appears to be in order, the lawman confirmed. Kieran studied the document, then handed it to Emma. The legal language was complex, but the intent was clear. Richard Blackwell was establishing Thomas as heir to a substantial estate. This is generous, Emma admitted, struggling to reconcile this gesture with her memory of the man who had abandoned Caroline. It's the least I can do, Blackwell replied simply. I have no other children, no close family. Thomas is Caroline's child and mine. I would like to know him, but I recognize that you are his parents now in all the ways that truly matter. A silence fell over the room as Emma and Kieran absorbed Blackwell's words and the implications of his offer. Emma looked down at Thomas, happily oblivious to the adult conversation that would shape his future. Then she glanced at Kieran, seeking his guidance in this unexpected turn of events. Kieran's expression was thoughtful, his initial hostility tempered by Blackwell's apparent sincerity. Emma and I need to discuss this privately, he finally said. Your proposal is not what we expected. I understand, Blackwell said, rising from his chair. I'll be in Willow Creek for another 3 days before returning east. Perhaps you could send word to the hotel when you've reached a decision. Sheriff Davis moved to escort Blackwell out, but Emma suddenly found herself speaking. Wait. All eyes turned to her as she shifted Thomas in her arms. Would you like to hold him? Before you go, the question surprised everyone, most of all Blackwell himself. For a moment he looked utterly vulnerable, his composed facade cracking to reveal genuine emotion. Yes, I would. With careful movements, Emma transferred Thomas into Richard Blackwell's arms. The professor held the baby with obvious inexperience but equally obvious reverence, his expression softening as Thomas reached up to pat his bearded cheek with curious fingers. Hello, Thomas, he said softly. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. The moment stretched, poignant and unexpected. Then Thomas began to fuss, reaching back toward Emma with increasing urgency. He's due for his nap, Emma explained, taking the baby back into her arms, and his bottle. Blackwell nodded, straightening his coat as if to recover his composure. He's beautiful, he said simply. Caroline would be proud of how you're raising him. After Blackwell and Sheriff Davis departed, Emma stood in the parlor with Thomas now contentedly drinking his bottle, her emotions a complex tangle of surprise, caution, and unexpected sympathy. What do you think? She asked Kieran, who was staring thoughtfully at the deed Blackwell had left behind. I think he's sincere, Kieran replied slowly. Whether that makes his proposal acceptable is another question entirely. He looked up at Emma, his expression serious. This must be your decision primarily, Emma. You knew Caroline, you knew Blackwell in Boston. I'll support whatever you feel is right for Thomas. Emma considered carefully, thinking of Caroline, her friend, who had faced her pregnancy with courage despite Blackwell's abandonment, who had entrusted her child to Emma with her dying breath. I think, she said finally, that Caroline would want Thomas to know his father despite everything. Not as a replacement for you, she added quickly, but as a connection to his origins, to her. Kieran nodded, accepting her reasoning. Then we'll establish boundaries, specific times for visitation, expectations for his involvement, and we'll hold him to them. And the trust, Emma asked, indicating the deed. We'll have Judge Harmon review it thoroughly, ensure it's properly structured for Thomas's benefit. Kieran smiled slightly. I may be a rancher, but I know better than to refuse an education fund for our son. Our son. The words still sent a thrill through Emma, a reminder of how completely her life had transformed in the months since arriving in Willow Creek. I love you, she told Kieran, stepping into the circle of his arms with Thomas between them. For your understanding, your strength, your willingness to build this family with me. Kieran pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to Thomas's downy head, and I love you both. Nothing will ever change that, not Richard Blackwell, not anyone. In the days that followed, they crafted a careful agreement with Blackwell, establishing parameters for his relationship with Thomas. He would visit Montana twice yearly, write monthly letters that Emma and Kieran would share with Thomas as he grew, and contribute to an education fund administered by the Willow Creek Bank. When Blackwell departed for the East, there was a newfound peace in the arrangement, not friendship, certainly, but a cautious alliance built around their shared concern for Thomas's well-being. As promised, Kieran and Emma renewed their vows privately on Christmas Eve, standing before the hearth in their bedroom with only Thomas as witness. They exchanged simple, heartfelt promises, reaffirming the commitment they had made before the community, but adding personal pledges meant only for each other's ears. Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the ranch blanketed in fresh snow that sparkled in the morning light. Emma woke to find Kieran already up, Thomas in his arms as he stood by the window, pointing out the winter wonderland to the wide-eyed baby. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Armstrong," he said, turning to greet her with a smile that still made her heart skip. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Armstrong," she replied, joining them at the window. "And Merry Christmas to you, Thomas Armstrong." As they stood together, watching the sun rise over their Montana home, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had arrived in Willow Creek as a mail-order bride, left at the depot with a baby in her arms and nowhere to go. A cowboy had said, "I'll raise him," and in doing so had offered not just assistance but a future, a family, a home, a love deeper and more genuine than anything Emma had dared to imagine. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Emma smiled, leaning against his shoulder as Thomas reached for her hair with grabbing fingers. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most perfect endings." Kieran's arm tightened around her waist. "Not an ending," he corrected gently. "Just the first chapter of our story." And as the new day brightened over the Armstrong ranch, Emma knew he was right. Their story, hers, Kieran's, and Thomas's, was only just beginning, with chapters yet to be written, challenges to face, and joys to discover together. It wasn't the life she had planned when boarding that westbound train in Boston, but standing here with her husband and their son, Emma knew with absolute certainty that it was the life she was meant to live. The mail-order bride had found her home, not with the man who had sent for her, but with the cowboy who had been waiting for her all along, even if neither of them had known it until that fateful September afternoon at the Willow Creek Depot.